Hello everyone and welcome back to the NPC Dungeon. I already did an episode a few weeks back on how as a player you can help the game run just a little bit more smoothly, but as this is mainly the DM's job, not completely the DM's job, as I do like to say, this is a group effort this game is, but since this is mainly the DM's job, I've been due for an episode on how to do this from the DM's perspective. By the way, if you haven't checked out that episode on how to make the game run a little more smoothly from the player's perspective, feel free to do that. I think it's a pretty good one. But moving on, I want to go ahead and say, much like last week's episode, I planned for this one to be a little broad as well. Real quick, last week's episode was on immersion. If you want to look into that one, feel free. I think it's another really good one. By the way, if you're listening to this on YouTube, feel free to comment and let me know if you prefer the more broad topic episodes, or if you prefer the episodes where I get a little bit more specific on the details I'm talking about. But anyway, with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into today's topic, and that is helping the game run more smoothly from the DM's perspective. So what can a DM do to help the game run just a little bit more smoothly? Well, I like to divide this topic into two parts because I find the techniques that I use to keep the game on track fall into two main categories. Those are one, things that I can do to make my own encounters more engaging and flow more smoothly from one to the other, and two, things that I can do to curb my players' behavior. And instead of focusing in and really narrowing in on one or the other, I decided that I was going to instead give a brief overview of both. However, I started writing and one point dominated the whole episode before I got a chance to even talk about the others, and if I decided to talk about them all here, this episode would probably end up being hours and hours long, so I didn't end up doing that. Instead, I decided to cover what you can do to make your encounters interesting and to help them flow more smoothly in this episode. After all, that feels natural, right? To do this first, because you make encounters first and then your players do them, and then you have to manage your players' behavior in them. Besides, I personally try to look at what I can do first to improve my encounters, as opposed to kind of blaming my players. More specifically, I decided to zero in on a single point this time and really explore it. That's kind of ironic considering I was going to make a really broad episode. And that point specifically is how you can take advantage of the fact that you create the context in which your players act, including how not to do it as well as how to do it, a few examples, and how just a little bit of extra planning can keep you from having to throw up a wall or something to stop your players or make bland encounters so that much going on, either because of unexpected player actions or because of something else. So let's learn something. So what can you do? Well, the first thing that comes to my mind that can make for an encounter that can hold up or otherwise clutter the road on which the game drives, thereby making it run a little bit less smoothly than it can, is that meandering sensation we've all had when given an encounter in no really clear direction. There are many reasons why this can happen, obviously, and they all have their own different solutions, but I'm going to try to give you a few tools to help you keep this from even happening in the first place. The first one is a combination of a few things that I've already said on this podcast, and those include that toolbox I'm always mentioning. I mentioned it in my episode on combat and my episode on how I plan for interesting and engaging encounters. And the second one is that idea of taking aspects for an encounter, like a wizard you want your player to run into, for example, that your players don't end up running into, and putting it somewhere else that still makes sense so they can still run into them. I go into a little bit more detail on this last one on my episode on how I structure interesting and engaging encounters. But for now, one of the reasons why this can occur is that your players may start an encounter that you didn't plan for or even think about. This is something that you need to know ahead of time that might happen. Sure, you won't be able to plan for it exactly, but no doubt you'll have other encounters that you planned for but didn't end up using, and no doubt you know about where the story is going right now. I should certainly hope so, at least. You can then pick from one of those encounters and fit it into the current story. But I understand, that's a lot to do on the spot. That's why, for one, you need to already have the mindset that you'll need to be changing things, and you need to pick up on little signs and hints that your party will be doing something possibly a little unexpected. Maybe they're discussing their plans or staking out a location. The moment you pick up on that, you need to start planning and setting up those little, up to this point, unpredictable contingencies. In fact, it's probably best to be on the lookout for this and to constantly be planning and preparing and modifying things for these difficulties that will no doubt end up arising. You may have to get a little creative, but ask yourself, what happens when they get there? Remember, you are the ultimate creator of the context in which your players' characters' actions, decisions, and choices ultimately take place, like I said earlier. And this is even possible with the initial encounter that led them on whatever so-called unpredictable enterprise they decided to embark on. What particular elements of the encounters push them along that path? Learn from that so that next time you can subtly nudge them in the direction that you need them to be in. It may not end up being exactly how you thought of it, but it never will. At least this way you have some plans. See, you could just wait, blunder your way through your own plans, and when your players try to do something unpredictable that you didn't expect, simply throw up a wall in front of them. But that's only a brute force way of stunting your players' creativity. And again, D&D is all about creativity. You don't want to stop that. And once it gets to that point where your players actually make the decision, it's difficult to go back. I'd even advise against going back, and you will inevitably get to the point where your players will do something unexpected. I'm not saying that you will be able to plan for everything your players do and that you can direct them certain ways, but if you plan just a little bit ahead of time and predict what they'll do and modify and change the things that you can change the encounters you make for them, it'll be a lot easier. And again, like I just said, I know you can't plan for everything, but this method can make certain things that may favor your plans, more likely for your players to do. And the little hints that you leave for this purpose can even have the added bonus of solidifying that toolbox of yours, giving you even more things to pull from. But I understand this may just sound like the nonsensical ravings of a deranged madman, so I'm going to give you a few examples to try to get across the general flavor of what I am trying to say here. So with the first example, I believe it was that same episode on encounters that I alluded to earlier, maybe you should check it out, I'm alluding to it a lot in this episode, that I first introduced an encounter that I once gave my players in which they had to outrun a horde of hook horrors. I also told this story in full last week if you're interested, but you may not know, however, that stampede wasn't planned for. The path that lay ahead wasn't where I had initially intended for them to go. I had intended for them to go to the abandoned town above the cave they were in. I had created the Kotoa city that lay there, but I hadn't crafted a good introduction to it yet, and that was my bad. And to make matters worse, the brief combat encounter that I had intended for them to go through along the way ended up being a little too easy. I had planned for them to run into 2 or 3 of these things, these hook horrors, and then have the hook horrors signal some friends of theirs in the middle of combat to really put them through their paces, so my players would have to run ahead and seek shelter. That would have been a good introduction to the Kotoa city, but they ended up defeating the hook horrors before more of their friends could arrive and decided to take a short rest. During this time, I took a little bit of time to gather my thoughts and took advantage of it. I devised a plan that would still lead them smoothly into the underground city, and it wasn't that difficult. I had to get a little creative, but I asked myself, what if the hook horrors' friends still did arrive? They got there a little late, but they brought more of their friends, and some of their friends' friends, and some of their friends. I didn't want to just do another combat that would sound a little boring to me, so I concocted a chase scene that worked with dazzling effect. They ran into the city by the skin of their teeth, one of my players actually nearly dying, which made for a really fun character interaction, and were discovered by the Kotoas living there, giving them even more reason to keep running and hiding. And again, even though you are the sole creator, or at least the main creator, of the context your players are in, I think this example is a really good lesson on how the campaign is not just your creation. Even though I did make the context, this encounter would have never happened, or wouldn't have been nearly as good as it was, had my players not went along the unexpected route. But it still happened because of the context that I did end up just simply creating for them. Again, like I always say, you're all working together on this. And what about how they got there to that cave in the first place? Well, I made that cave they entered in through long before they got there, and I was ready to just skip it, erase it, and pretend it just didn't exist and never mention it because it didn't really offer that much to the story. But then one of my players wanted a Flumph familiar. Well, there just happened to be Flumphs in the cave, so I simply added it back in and said that they came across it on the way as they would have done otherwise. This is what I mean when I say make little alterations along the way. And what this did is that it sent them along a path I didn't fully expect, but I had things to pull from for when they got there. I had a previous enemy that followed them there, and I had the underground city. Simple solution, the enemy fought them, and the Flumphs directed them to the underground city. And again, that's another embedded example of how I had to change what happened and put things directly in their path to kind of nudge them along. I completely avoided having to just throw up a wall in front of them or anything like that, simply with just a little bit of clever planning. For another example, just look at a very recent encounter I ran. I mentioned this counter a little bit already on my last episode on immersing your players. I said that my players were fighting a bunch of blights in a wagon, but how did they get there in the first place? Well, they were riding along another wagon already to the destination that I'd created for the quest they're going on when one of them attacked the driver. This player's character didn't like imps, and well, there was an imp driving this wagon into the forest. When they attacked the imp, he transformed into a bat, directed the wagon into a tree, directed the wagon into a tree first, then transformed into a bat, and then flew away. This session ended with my players crash landing and rolling out of the wagon injured in the middle of the forest. Luckily, this is where the session ended up having to end, so I had a little bit of time to plan. The person the imp was working for had to run into them somewhere, so I devised plans for the different things they could do. They could turn back, they could walk forward. If they turned back, they would see the imp's employer on the road driving toward them. If they went forward, the employer would be ahead and stopped along the road yelling at the imp for losing the party. But they didn't end up doing either of those. They simply kind of stood there, which seems like a problem because I didn't plan for that. But all was well. I simply had the imp's employer ride up along the path that they were at and stop in front of them. After all, he was looking for them. And for fear of beating that point to death a little bit, let's move on to another reason why your encounters might fall flat, and that's what if your players are in danger of being overpowered? This can also wrinkle up your plans a little, but I want to say again, you create the context for the story, so you can still get around this a little bit, but you want to be careful. So let's see a few examples. For one, let's say one of your player's characters have explosives, but end up giving them a puzzle door. Your player might just blow the door up and circumnavigate your puzzle that way. Now, you could just say that this door just happens to be indestructible to the certain types of explosives they happen to have with them, but that's a little boring, it's not fun, you're just throwing up a wall in front of them, and I'll be honest, it strikes me as a little bit immature. An easy way around this is just to plan ahead beforehand and use what you can control and what you can change and what you can create to direct the context, just like I've been saying throughout this whole episode. Maybe you put a creature of some kind in the chamber they're in. Now, blowing that door up would have some consequences, wouldn't it? When you do this, word of warning, make sure it does make sense in the context. Don't make it look like you're just putting things to hold them back, because sometimes things would be that easy. Let it happen. If they blow up the door, fine, great, good. But if something would work in the world that can make things a little more interesting, don't be afraid to throw it in. And there's still one more obvious hole in this I want to go ahead and examine right quick. They could just blow up the monster. They could just take whatever you did and find a simple way around that. And if they do that, if they can find a way to sneak up to the monster, in this case, plant explosive on it and do enough damage to kill it before it wakes up and still have enough left over to blow up the door, good for them. You made a challenge and they navigated it well. The truth is that you're going to have encounters like this where your players find ways around them, and that's great. Chances are they had to either be careful or creative in some way to do so, and that's ideal. Again, you want them to be creative. Don't be immature about it and try to change it on them or force it to go your way. Remember, only change those things that you are able to change when you are able to do so. Once you are in the encounter, you can't take it back last minute, like I said earlier. So again, do all your planning ahead of time. But what about when your player is in the process of getting this item, in this case the explosives, that would allow them to become overpowered in this way or that way? Well, whatever they get is something that you give them, and you can kind of use this to your advantage. I'll give you an example. Maybe you have a player who wants to learn a whole other language. Cool. It won't happen all at once. It won't happen in one session. It'll happen gradually. And when it does happen, it probably won't constantly come into play. But to examine this example a little bit further, if they end up finding things out they aren't supposed to know with this new language of theirs, you only have yourself to blame. You made the context in which that happened. You created the story, and you made the context out of the little alteration that you made along the way. After all that, if they still end up breaking the story, they didn't break anything, you did. But let's say the language they try to learn is really important, and it would give things away like enemy battle plans or things that you have like plot twists or something later on. Do you just bar them from learning it? Absolutely not. You just don't create as many situations in which they'd come across the plans and lessen the situations in which they would see the language. Obviously, don't lessen it to an unrealistic degree, so if they see this language a lot, you can't just take it away, but you can manage the situations in which they see it. You see, there are many different ways of getting to a certain plot point, and I'm sure some of those ways involve less of that language. Besides, if what you're so afraid of them finding out is that important, there will probably be other security measures around it as well. And if your players do end up finding out about it and deciding to go and infiltrate and grab it, that's cool. That can make for a really great encounter. And if it is some enemy information or something like that, even better. The things that your players can do with that information could end up making for an even better encounter that you could have made for them on your own. It's just like I said with the flume, for example. But notice what I didn't say. Notice the fixes I didn't give. Notice I didn't say that they just change the language without prompting, or that they simply change their plans. To be fair, they may very well do this if they realize the players are onto them. As I said earlier, the amount by which you negate the effect your players have, in this case the language, has to be within reason. And this applies to more than just languages. It applies to weapons you give them magic items, armor, miscellaneous equipment, and abilities too. But be careful doing this. You don't want to just give them something only to keep them from using it. You want them to use it, so give them opportunities to do so. But I'm also not saying that you can just give them anything thing either. For example, you may want to think twice before giving them a sword that can kill things in one hit. And if you do end up accidentally giving them something a little bit unbalanced and you're out of options, don't be afraid to talk to them about reducing its power a little. These things happen, and we need to work together again, like I said, if we all want to have fun. But I'll talk more about magic items and such on a future episode. Next Friday, I'm going to talk a little bit more about immersion. More specifically, I'm going to go into one of the most potent tools you have in terms of emotion. That's the character-drivenness of the story. But after that, I plan to come back to this topic and zoom in again, this time, again on encounters, but this time on how you can avoid these kinds of encounters and make smoother, more engaging ones using that 3-part structure that I outlined in my episode on interesting and engaging encounters. I even have an episode planned about adding those little details I mentioned before in my most recent episode on immersion, and obviously on curbing player behavior like I mentioned before on this one. Of course, next week I'll also have the final Bonk story ready, so be ready for that. And if you like this specific style where I zoom in on one point, let me know by commenting if you're listening to this on YouTube. But until next time, let's learn something.